Okay, so now we're at question number 8. We're going to start by reading it as is and hearing how it sounds. Let's begin. The habit of pulling water into its trunk, period, then releasing that water into its mouth develops only after months, as if witnessing other elephants doing so. Okay, what do you notice about this first sentence here? The habit of pulling water into its trunk. Well, we should recognize that that doesn't sound like a complete thought. And you would be right, it's not a complete sentence. So we know F has to be incorrect because I can't put a period there. Periods only exist after I have a complete thought. So F would be out. And if we were using our technique of concision and subvocalization, which I'll write down here again for you. Remember, concision or concise answers are ones that are not wordy and ones that have the least amount of punctuation. We would pick that option first and we would subvocalize it, which means hear how it sounds. If it sounds correct 80% of the time, that'll get us to the right answer. So the shortest one is going to be J, trunk. So let's subvocalize that and hear how it sounds. The habit of pulling water into its trunk, then releasing that water into its mouth, develops only after months. The habit of pulling water into its trunk releasing. Doesn't that sound awkward? Into its trunk releasing. So you want to hang on that and recognize that sounds jarring. Go with that instinct and you would get rid of J. Next you would be left with G and H. So why don't we just start with G and hear how that sounds. The habit of pulling water into its trunk and then releasing that water into its mouth develops only after months. That sounds smooth, so we know G is most likely going to be the right answer. And if you were short on time or you weren't sure grammatically why that's correct, you could circle G and then move on. Let's go through the other options now. We already went through F. We recognize that that was a sentence fragment. I can't put a period there. Now let's go through H and figure out why that would be incorrect. The habit of pulling water into its trunk, then by releasing that water. This then by releasing that water doesn't make sense. And again, this would just be a case of something that really makes no sense. And because you can't make sense out of it, it would be wrong. And remember, sometimes the ACT likes to give you answer choices that logically don't work. So we want to be aware of them and mark them wrong anytime we see them. Likewise with J, J makes no sense, trunk releasing, right? So if you caught that, you'd recognize that also makes no sense. So J would be wrong. Now let's just take a moment here and dissect this just a little bit further. There's another perspective by which we could recognize what the correct answer was, or at least assess why something is incorrect. So when I say the habit of pulling water into its trunk, something you should recognize is that this whole bit right here is the subject. The habit of pulling water into its trunk. And we should be scanning the rest of this sentence here in search of a verb to make sense of this. Now, if you were scanning, where would you place the verb? Right, the verb is placed right here, develops. The habit of pulling water into its trunk develops only after months. So we recognize that we have a subject over here and a verb over here. Once we recognize the subject and the verb, it can be a lot easier to simplify sentences. The habit of pulling water into its trunk and then releasing that water into its mouth develops. So in other words, this whole thing here, the habit of pulling water into its trunk and then releasing it into its mouth, you can consider this whole thing right here as just a very long subject. Now there's a lot of phrases, what we call prepositional phrases, that you don't need to know about, but just know that this whole thing you could consider as the subject, and then this would be the verb. So just be aware that there's multiple ways of looking at questions to figure out what the right answer is. But you can always rely on this concision and subvocalization technique. It's a really good way of recognizing if an answer is correct or not. Once we did that, we went through each of these options and we recognized that H and J just made no sense. There wasn't any way to assess whether or not it could have been H or J grammatically, because it wouldn't make sense logically. So we would get rid of them. And F was wrong because it's a sentence fragment. Thank you.